Hey guys, Ruben here. In this video, I'm going to guide you step by step through the setup of your Amplitude account and show you how to avoid 3 common mistakes. So by the end of the video, you are able to make data-driven decisions. Scratch that. 2026, this will be AI-driven decisions. I have helped more than 100 companies do the same, and my previous videos on Amplitude have thousands of views and happy viewers just like you. Before we dive in, if you still haven't created your Amplitude account, there's an affiliate link in the video description that you can use to support this channel. So step number 1, find the link in the video description, go over to the Amplitude website, and then you want to look for the Get Started button in the top right. You get an option here to enter your email. I'll use a temporary email here so we can see the process from start to finish. We're going to enter a name. I'm going to choose the storage location of the US. Of course, if you're in the European Union, you'll choose the other one. We're going to agree to the terms, and I'll skip the promotional emails for now, and then we'll click continue. All throughout the video, you can actually follow along with this Hulk-like cursor I have here. You can see it kind of gets bigger as you shake it. Okay, so we need a password of some sort. Now, we're going to answer a few questions. Now, we are not ready to send data yet. We actually have to do a few steps before we ever write a single line of code, and you'll see why very shortly. So we're going to do not yet, and we're going to actually skip this as well. Perfect. So now we land in the Amplitude home, and there's nothing here, even though there's a little dot here that is blinking. There's no data, and that makes sense. Now we're going to fix that. However, there's a couple of things we have to do from the account structure perspective before we can start setting data. So go to the top right to look to your settings and then organization settings. This is the organization you created. Of course, you can change the name if you like or the org URL to match your domain, but we want to go specifically to projects. You're going to see there's one project called Default created by Amplitude. We actually want to change this and give it a different name. I want to use this FinTech mobile app for a demo today. So I'm going to call it FinTech Dev, and this will be our development project. And we're going to use a description here, the dev project for all testing. In the project settings, there's a couple of things to note. One is a time zone. All the timestamps in Amplitude use UTC, Universal Time Coordination Time Zone. Man, I just saw this too. It's UTC. But from a reporting perspective, you can change this to whatever you want. I am actually in Vancouver, so I'm going to change it to PST. Then our week will start Monday in January. Again, if you're in the Middle East, you may want to start your week on a Sunday and perhaps a different quarter. And then the calendar style standard is fine. There is a retail option here. If you're in retail, I actually never used this myself, but it looks to be a 4-5 calendar idea. If you're in retail, you probably know about that. Then the other stuff here, you can see some are locked, like anything that has a little icon here basically requires some kind of upgrade to a paid plan. But for now, this is all we need in this specific project. Let's go back to the main project screen, and now we're gonna create a second project, and we're gonna call this, as you might expect, FinTech Prod, if you're paying attention, and this will be all the production data will go here. All right. And just like before, we wanna match whatever settings you chose in the dev project here. So I'll go find my time zone, Vancouver. I left everything the same, and we are good. One final step from the account structure perspective is you may want to add members. You can see I'm the only member here. You can invite new users, just add their email. And then from here, you can actually choose the different permissions. You can send an invite link, and you can, of course, import contacts, whether it's from Google or Slack. So there's a few ways for you to invite people into your Amplitude account. Now, on this rock of an account structure, we can then start sending data. But before we get to the code part, we need to plan it. In this section, we're going to avoid what I think is the biggest mistake that companies make. And if you avoid this mistake, you can save yourself 80% of the headaches that can come when trying to set up Amplitude. That's how powerful this is. And this is really mistake number 1 that we're going to avoid. And we're going to avoid it by using a document called a tracking plan. Now I'm going to show this Google Sheets. There's an Excel version. There's a link in the description if you want to access this exact same document, or if you can create your own. Now the document has a few useful tabs. So we have the how to use tab that just gives you overall instructions on the document. We're going to do the bulk of our work here in the events and properties tab, and I'm going to explain the other 4 tabs as we go along in the video, so stick around for that. The point of the tracking plan is to understand the different elements that we need to send into Amplitude, where they will come from, and why they are important to us. Now, before we get to that, let's talk about the 3 building blocks of Amplitude data. And it doesn't matter if you're here for the AI features, the AI feedback, or AI agents, you're here for the data analysis, or anything else. This 3 building blocks is necessary for nearly everything in Amplitude. Throughout this video, I'm going to use a demo account that Amplitude provides. You can actually access this with your free account. If you go to projects, and you'll see you can export sample data. And this is a fintech product. And what we have here is a user profile in Amplitude. Now, all the data in Amplitude can really be organized under profiles. And then whenever you do analysis, you are aggregating the profiles into some larger query. A profile has our 3 building blocks. The first building block is visible here in the profile. And it's right here in the center of the screen, right here. Did you like that annotation? That's cool, right? I've just upgraded this. Each event here is an action. So plan, upgrade, offer, money transfer complete, invite friend offer, app open. These are all actions in your app that a user can do and that are important to you. You may have purchases, onboarding events, aha moments, retention. They're all captured as events. If we click into any of them, like money transfer complete, we can see the second builder block, which are event properties. The event properties give us more details on this specific action. What was the amount that was transferred? What was the currency? What was the document type? How did the user log in, or how did the user sign up? All these things are given to us in the event properties. And again, you're passing all this manually. You're manually passing the money transfer completed. You're manually passing all these event properties. There are some automated properties, which we'll see in a second. But generally, the manual data points is what gives you unique insights into your product. The third building block are the profile properties. So this user, which has this Amplitude ID, also has properties here. And the user properties tell us more information about who the user is. This user, for example, has made 0 purchases, it seems like. We have no city or language, which means this is likely some backend data. But we do have 18 more user properties down here. We have things like usage time at 26 minutes. We have age, which was definitely passed manually. Again, Amplitude doesn't have this for you. Then we have some of the city and country data, which seems to be being passed specifically in another way than the default option. Then we have income. All these profile properties tell us a little bit more about who the user is and specific behavioral attributes that we may care about. One quick point on property types. Here's what Amplitude supports. Pretty standard strings. You can have numbers, you can have booleans, there's arrays, enums, a possible set of values you may have as a constant, or perhaps when you define a property, it could be any. This is just for actual specific validation with an Amplitude. I do believe there are other options like objects, which we might see a little bit later on in this video. But generally, you're taking whatever type makes the most sense and then using that. So of course, an amount is a number. It wouldn't be a currency, right? Because there's no currency here. But a number will work. Then the login type is a string. You may have some kind of boolean. The user do this or not, true or false, that kind of stuff. Document here, we are going to fill this out with the 3 building blocks. We're going to have events, the key actions in your app. We're going to have event properties, the details about those actions. And then we're going to have profile properties that tell us more about the user along the way. That is our goal in this stage of the setup. Now let's talk about naming convention before we write anything in this document. You can see I actually have a whole row here just for naming convention. This can be a bit of an emotional topic, if I'm honest. Some people get really, really excited about this and really adamant that there's a specific way of doing it. My take is that the key thing when it comes to a naming convention is consistency, but the specific naming convention you use doesn't really matter as much. Come at me, I don't know. But let's look at a few options that you might see out there, and then you can decide what is the best for you. There are 3 elements about a naming convention that we need to consider, and then you can make the best choice for you. The first thing is the structure of it. This is sometimes seen from the perspective of whether you have the object and then the action followed, which would be something like video watch or video share. In this case, the video is the object and then share is the action. You may do action object where you do watch video or share video two options. Sometimes I think I've seen this as like verb and noun somewhere out there, so you may see that too. The point is, you have the key thing you're looking at, and then some kind of action that happens. So maybe someone starts a payment, then finishes the payment, or completes the payment, or shares the payment, and the payment is the object, and then there's some kind of action that's taking place on that object. The second thing is the tense. So it could be in past tense or present tense. All this, of course, is present tense, video share, but you could do video watch or equal video shared. And of course, down here, watch video or share video. Same thing, within the wrong cell. I actually want to hear. There is no future tense, typically. Watch video, will watch video. I don't think that works. So it's typically just the past and the present. And then lastly, we have what may be the actual naming convention itself. That is, we are doing spaces here, video space watch, but it could also be video underscore watch or video camel case, watch, or I guess you could have title case. Maybe there's a few other ones out there that I'm not familiar with. Again, I don't think any of these are better than other ones. I quite like this video underscore watch, but again, that's just my preference. The key thing is when I just choose something and stay consistent. And then down here in the plan, you can then specify what will be your naming convention. Is it going to be all lowercase with an underscore and it's going to be in the present tense? Great. And then you might do the same for properties and then profile properties, and you make that clear to everyone that this is the naming convention. Any event in the future will have to follow it. The reason why is these 4 events here are actually completely different for Amplitude. Amplitude is case sensitive, so it will treat them differently. And the biggest issue sometimes you see in this implementation is that you have data that's not consistent and it breaks, and there's multiple events that seem to represent a purchase. You purchase complete, purchase finish, just purchase, and people don't know, and then they don't trust the data. So establishing a naming convention early is key to avoiding that. Amplitude also has some cool tools to help you enforce naming convention. And in the worst case scenario, if you ever make a mistake, there's also ways to merge events into a single one. But again, those are all actions that you're taking once you make the mistake. You can save yourself a lot of headaches by trying to prevent the mistake from the beginning. Now that we have our naming convention and we know what the building blocks are, now we can start to actually create the plan itself. Now, the way I've always done this in, 100 plus projects is I like to open the app itself, whether it's a mobile app on iOS and Android or a web app, or you may have both, of course, and then navigate the app logically through each of the key steps and then note those steps in the tracking plan as I go along. This might take a couple hours. If you don't have an app live in production, I've also done this just with Figma designs. And you go, I guess, design by design and try to see what is the action that may work. That's also a possibility. Now, I have this sample app I found online. You can see it's a mobile app. And we're going to go through some of the screens this is showing. There's no real data here. But it can give you a sense of how I am navigating things in the app and then going back to a tracking plan and then go back and forth. So we open the app and we see that there's the classic 4 screens. Let's see if we go back here actually. So there were 3 screens that are pretty common in apps before you get to some kind of login or sign up screen. So I will go back to my tracking plan and I clearly want something like a screen view. I think I'm going to go underscore for simplicity. We're going to have an event called screen view, and I'm going to fire this whenever a user views a screen in the mobile app. This is, of course, the equivalent of a page view on web. And for event properties, I'll keep the underscore naming convention, and you may want the screen name. I don't know, this screen name might be called like onboarding 1 or onboarding 2 or onboarding 3. And then it might be nice to also have the screen ID just in case. It's always helpful to have IDs because the names may change, right? Those screen names may be different in the future, but perhaps the screen ID might not change. Possibly. So we have those 2 things, kind of pretty simple event to begin with. No profile properties to set at this point in time. We actually don't know who the user is, so we'll talk about user ID management in the next section. That's our first event. Now, this event also gives us a chance to explore another pitfall you may run when building your tracking plan, which is going too specific in event names. So we do have a screen view, which is a global event, and you can see that we're going to then segment out by an event property called screen name to be able to get down to a specific screen. So if we pass all the screen names in your app, then you can actually look at any screen and just focus on that, or you can look at an aggregate or multiple combinations. Sometimes what teams do is they'll get too specific. Instead of saying screen view global, they'll do something like screen view, boarding 1. I guess we'll keep that. And then there'll be, well, now there's a second screen. So obviously I'm going to do screen view, onboarding 2, right? And they go on and on. So now an event that could be a single event, just one single, becomes 5, 10, 15, 20 events. And that can start to make your data really messy. Most apps don't really need that many events. 10, 20, 30 events to understand everything. But I've seen implementations where you have hundreds, if not thousands of events, and it just becomes incredibly unruly. So whenever possible, you really want to stick to global events and then use the event properties as a way to segment down to any specificity that you need. Now, this is also why we do this in some kind of non-code format, Google Sheets, Excel, paper. I guess you could print it if you are the kind of person that has a printer. I don't know. And it's super easy to just say, you know what, I initially thought that I might have 3 events for screen view, but I can now see that I could probably condense that. So I'll just simply remove those, stick with 1, no problem, right? So when I do this for clients, I make this mistake myself because I might see something, I might be like, oh, that's kind of interesting. I'll put that as an event, then another one. And then when I do go through the editing process, I'm like, you know what? These 2 events are almost identical in event properties. Maybe I can condense them. It's also helpful to know that there is a bunch of properties I'm not listing here that maybe you were thinking about because you're on the ball. Things like city, country, region, device information, right? Am I on iOS or an Android? Perhaps those things cross your mind. The reason why I don't include them is a lot of these properties are actually typically automatically collected by Amplitude, so we don't need to tell developers to collect them manually. Let's see those. The client SDKs will collect a few things for us. Let's look at some of them. One is location. So Amplitude will take the user's IP address and then parse it into city, region, which is state, country, and even give you a DMA. So one single property gives you 4. Again, this all happens behind the scenes. You don't have to do anything. And there's some logic here what happens when the IP is not available. Then Amplitude will take the user agent and device information and then parse that into 5 properties. Actually, to more, into 8, 9? So we might get device brand, which may be Apple, Samsung, so on. Device manufacturer, which is kind of similar but slightly different. Device model, device type, OS name, OS version. Platform, which is super helpful. A lot of time, the breakdown that we need is just by platform. Did this event occur on web, iOS, or Android, or TV, or something like that? Then we have browser and browser version, of course, on a browser itself, not so much the mobile app. And there's some logic here on how this actually works. You can actually disable this if you have concerns about privacy. But the underlying point is you're going to get a bunch of properties, both event properties and profile properties from Amplitude whenever you use the client SDKs, JavaScript, iOS, Android, React Native. And in our tracking plan, we're not going to list them. It might confuse developers. And so the only things I include in the tracking plan are what a developer needs to manually pass into Amplitude. But there is an exception with this automatically collected properties when it comes to backend SDKs, but we're going to see that more in the next section as well. One more point about the automatic collected properties is you will see them in Amplitude whenever they have the Amplitude logo next to it. So you can see here that this city DMA, region, and wherever country is, are technically the automatically collected properties with Amplitude. And then the ones that don't have the logo are the ones that are being passed manually. And you can kind of see the same logic elsewhere. So this demo account, intriguingly enough, does not actually have city, DMA, and region being passed automatically. It must be some kind of backend data, but it is passed manually here. This honestly will not be the best practice here, because if you're passing a city manually and a country manually, instead of using just the default out-of-the-box ones, it can start to get a bit confusing, and this will not be ideal, in my opinion. I will not want to replicate something that Amplitude already has out of the box. That's already had to. And even if you pass it manually, you may want to use the default property name, which is I think just country or region. So then we have the little Amplitude logo next to it, and then we can use it appropriately. So just a special note, as you can see some of the nuance when it comes to how you collect data for Amplitude. So let's continue on with our app. Now we get to a key point in the app process, which is the login or the sign up. We're actually going to do the sign up first. So here we're asking for name and a mobile number. I type anything. This is not my mobile number, as you can see. Don't call it. Maybe do call it. See who picks up. So we'll click sign up. You also saw there's an option there to do a sign up by SSO, Google, Facebook, and so on. So now we can go back to our plan, and we're gonna do sign up here. when the user provides their name and phone number. And we now have any option. So we did get 2 new properties, which would be name, which could be the full name of the user, or the phone number, which was whatever that was. Can't remember. So we could track these as event properties and profile properties. A couple notes about this. Amplitude officially does not recommend that you pass PII into Amplitude itself. It's my understanding that it is not against the terms of service, unlike, let's say, Google Analytics, where it is against the terms of service to pass PII. You are able to pass PII. I have been on many Amplitude projects where we do pass some form of PII, name, email, phone number, gender. I actually think this demo account had age, right? Somewhere in here, age, which I think is a PII, but maybe not. Either way, this is your choice. Depending on your privacy policies, if you're in the European Union or not, you can decide to pass this or not pass this. This is technically not needed. We do need a user ID, and so we would pass some kind of user ID, but typically a user ID might be something like this, right? Like a number. You can even hash the user ID if you so need to. But we're also going to look at the user ID in more detail in next section, the technical details, just because there's actually quite a bit to talk about there. If we do pass it, it of course makes sense to pass it as a profile property as well. Now, this also gives us a chance to talk about profile properties. The way Amplitude captures profile properties is it captures them at the time of the event itself. So when we fire this event called money transfer completed, you can see there's some user properties here. So at this point in time, Amplitude captures what the profile properties are. So in here, you have this age 29, auto top up true, whatever. In a future event, the age might change. But if you go back to any historical events, you might still see values of 29. That is, the profile properties are a reflection of their values at that point in time and not the latest value possible. Some tools are different, actually. Mixpanel in particular is different. It actually shows you the latest profile properties no matter what. Amplitude gives you the historical versions, so you can go back in time to any event, see what those profile properties were, and you can see the latest ones by just simply going and finding the latest event the user has fired. So when you pass a profile property here, you are simply storing that value at that point in time alongside the event. Amplitude will then persist the profile property. So in this case, let's imagine that when a user invited a friend, we then set city and country, but then we don't set it again during money transfer completed or plan upgrade and session, but we can still see them. They're still coming in. That's because Amplitude will persist profile properties going forward. So you set them once, and any events going forward will then have the same values until one day you decide to update those values if you do that. We can also look at another special property type, which would be the timestamps. So we do have a created, which follows a format called the ISO 8601. Super technical, I know. It basically just looks like year, month, date, and then the time. And again, all of this will be in UTC. So if we're going to pass any kind of timestamps into Amplitude, then we will use that format. So in this case, we can pass whenever the user account was created. It's always a handy property to have. And same thing, we will probably store that as profile property. Now, if you have a sign-up event, you're also going to have a login event, of course, when the user logs in. It's kind of helpful actually to duplicate whatever you do in the sign-up for the login. The reason why is if your product is already in production, you're going to have lots of users where you won't have this profile properties because they already create an account before you implemented Amplitude. So the login gives you a touch point that when the user comes back and logs in, we'll reset whatever we care about, whether it's the PII stuff like name and phone, or the user ID, or the created, or anything else. Some companies like to also do it when the user just opens the app again, when it comes back, I guess, from the foreground to the background, whatever it is. And then we reset this and send this back to Amplitude. But the sign up and the login tend to capture a lot of it. And over time, let's say over 30 days, whatever your usage frequency is, you can then have the vast majority of users have all these properties inside Amplitude. Okay, so let's do one more. So now we need to verify our account here. We're going to do the great code of 1, 2, 3, 4. Again, we'll probably go back here and simply do let's verify account. When the user verifies their phone number, in this case, we're using the OTP. We don't really care about any event properties. We're not going to pass a specific code in this case, but we might actually want to pass a profile property called, maybe call it like phone verification, typo there. True. So that could be interesting, right? We can look at all the users and say how many users actually verify the phones. We can do it with an event or a profile property. It's kind of handy sometimes to have a couple ways of doing something when it comes from a report perspective. So that'll be okay. This also kind of gives us a sense of some of the behavioral stuff that we may want to capture in Amplitude. Okay, now we're going to allow notifications, maybe yes, more personal information, more home address, identity verification, and so forth. So you can see how all of that will become individual events. Allow notifications, and then maybe update profile will have like the first name and last name. Again, if you want to capture that in Amplitude, and so forth. And you go down, down, down until you do your entire app. In this case, the iOS app is probably very similar, if not identical, to the Android app. So we can just do one of the apps. So if they are different, you have to tackle that. And if you have a web app, you would then go and do something the same. At the end of this process, and this might take you a couple hours, maybe more if it's your first time, you would have 20, 30, 40 events in your tracking plan. You then want to go through, of course, and do some editing to condense them whenever possible, to reduce them. And then you have your final list of events, which means we can move on to some of the other parts in the tracking plan itself. One more thing though, before we jump into there, we do have this column called notes, where I like to sometimes provide a couple notes for developers, nothing too complex. Might say something like 8 strings are in the ISO 8601 format. If you really want to impress them, you can use the technical terminology. I won't provide code samples here. We're actually going to have this implementation checklist where we can then provide specific links to parts in the documentation. So down here, for example, when they start to implement events, then we can actually send them directly to, let's say, the JavaScript or iOS or Android documentation so you can see what those code samples look like. Generally, it's not a complex topic once the developer sees it. So I don't need to pass it for them or give them something that's super detailed. I just want to link them to the right point in the documentation. But the other points in the tracking plan are also helpful. We can kind of take a look at now. The first thing is the SDK. Once we have our events, let's say you have the sign up a login event, then we need to determine where the event will come from. So I put here some drop-down values. Of course, you can change those to fit your app in particular, but we may say, this event needs to come from JavaScript, iOS, and Android. So it actually will come from 3 different apps, 3 different SDKs, and when the developers implement this event, they need to use the exact event name sign up with the exact event properties and the exact profile properties. The event should be identical across all 3 platforms because remember, it gives that platform property that it gets from the user agent and so on. So we don't need to specify this at the event name or event property or profile property level. What you don't want to do, 100%, do not do this, is do sign up mobile or sign up desktop. You don't want to do that. There's no need for that. Platform will do that for us. One exception here, which is reasonable, sometimes the web app and the mobile apps have different onboarding steps. It's kind of the same information, a first name, a last name, an email, a phone number, but the steps are actually different. Maybe the web app does it all in one screen and the mobile app does it all in like 5 different screens. You might have different onboarding events for web and mobile, possibility. But again, as much as possible, you really want to condense and have the same consistent events across platforms because it will make easier then to analyze across platform, especially because fundamentally the user's kind of doing similar things. You may also set a priority. So in your 20, 30 events, of course, you're not going to go implement all 20 events. It's going to take too much time. So you may want to set some stuff as P1 and maybe some other stuff as P2. You kind of determine this based on your priorities. Are you really interested in retention or onboarding or activation? That kind of determines what you do here. And then you have a handy status column in case you want to track where things are at for this specific event. And when it comes to SDKs, the general best practice is you want to use backend SDKs as much as possible, perhaps 80% of your implementation. But client SDKs tend to be faster, a little easier to work with. That is, in many companies, I find it's much more likely you can find a front-end developer than the back-end developer from a resource perspective. And client SDKs do give us a bunch of stuff out of the box, like those automatically collected properties we saw earlier, which if you use a back-end SDK, you have to then replicate on your own. So there's a few options here. You can see pretty standard stuff. Here's the JavaScript web one, then you have Android, iOS, React Native, Python. You, of course, have just a general HTTP API, which you can use for pretty much any backend implementation. It's also helpful to look at some of the other sources of data you might have in Amplitude, just because some of your data might come from SDKs, you're doing some manual implementation, but other data may come from another source. So you can see some of them here. So, of course, you may have some data in BigQuery or some kind of data warehouse, where you then just simply modify the data into a SQL query and then you import that into Amplitude. You can do that as a one-time process or as an ongoing process. I've done this myself. It's quite handy. So don't limit yourself to simply what needs to be manually tracked. You can actually work with your development team to say, hey, where's all this data? If you look at this event called, does this event exist anywhere right now where we can easily access it, maybe in the data warehouse, and then just bring it in? Now, of course, if you go this route, there's specific things you have to think about for each data source. For example, the BigQuery one, you have to structure the data in a specific format and then have specific properties so it gets accepted properly, but you can work through that. You may also have other tools. For example, you may have a tool like Braze, and then Braze can send you a bunch of events like email click, email open, email sent. That might be handy. You may have data in Google Analytics 4, and there's actually a way to take the data from Google Analytics 4 into BigQuery and then from BigQuery into Amplitude. And again, Google Analytics 4 gives you a bunch of stuff out of the box like page views and screen views, app open and so on, so that you can have all the data come in from there into Amplitude through a bit of a special connection. So all that can be captured here. Honestly, I think this Amplitude SDK will actually be probably better known as like Amplitude Source. And then you may have SDKs and other sources for each event. Now let's look at some of the other tabs before we move on to the technical section, the fun section, I like to call it. First is an MTU calculator. So Amplitude charges based on MTU. Here's the pricing at the time of this recording. So there is a free plan. You get 50,000 MTUs. These are monthly track users. These are individual users who are accessing your app. And you have 10 million events. And I believe once you get to the paid plans, you have 300,000 MTUs. You can actually do a quick estimate here. You can see what it will cost you to be on the Plus plan, whether you pay annually or monthly. So it's helpful to try and estimate your MTUs ahead of your implementation. Due to how MTUs work, since you're tracking users and not specific events, the way you tend to estimate MTUs is by coming up with specific product sections. So one section of your product may be, for example, the marketing site. And you can say, hey, now these are any pages on the myapp.com website. Then you go to some kind of source, maybe Google Analytics 4, something else, and you try to estimate the number of MTUs for the last 30 days. And if you wanted to optimize this, you say, you know what, it seems a little too high. Like I'm trying to fit in with, 100,000 MTUs, whatever it is, whatever you're trying to do. You can maybe look at some optimization ideas here where you say, you know what, let's only track the paid ads landing pages. So we're not going to track the entire marketing website and the knowledge base and the case studies and the videos. We're only going to do the 5 or 6 landing pages that we care about. And once we do that, it turns out that our traffic becomes 100,000. Great. Now we do the same thing, right? We may see during the onboarding, we have this on web and mobile, and then that gives us another 500,000 users. But to be simple, let's only track iOS. That brings it down to 250, whatever it is. So this is how you can start to do some optimizations for MTUs. It is tricky. We can only take entire swaths of the product or entire platforms, iOS or Android or web. But you do have some options when it comes to price and optimization if you need that. Next, we have the checklist. We saw that briefly. Just being able to have links for developers and, of course, other people who are involved in the process, linking the documentations, making any notes. It's always kind of handy. You may have other tools as well you're implementing at the same time. Add this data issues tab where you can track any ongoing issues. If you have something like Jira or Asana or Monday.com or whatever, you may just use that. But it's also a nice backup option. And then lastly, we have some common issues and solutions. These are actually 29 or something common issues I've seen in Amplitude implementations over 10 years. And I just added the solutions to those issues and any documentation links that may help you solve that. Again, if you want this exact same tracking plan with all the 6 tabs, 7 tabs, whatever it is, there's a link in the description. You can access that. And once you finish your tracking plan, once you have planned your data calmly, you are now ready to start thinking about code. Technical details, here we are. Now, it's important to get the technical details right because developer time is one of the most scarce resources in the universe. In every project I work with, it was always tough to get enough developer time. Whenever we go to developers, we want to go in with the right plan, which is why we go through this entire tracking plan process. We don't want to just half-ass the instructions to developers. And we also want to be able to explain key concepts quickly. They don't waste too much time going down rabbit holes, and you can just go straight to the implementation. The first concept I want to go over in technical details is auto capture. So auto capture is something relatively new in the world of Amplitude. It was initially added for web. I believe now it's on iOS and Android as well, at least the plain native SDKs, I guess you call it. Auto capture can capture some data for you, both events and event properties out of the box. It can be quite handy. Now, I just have here a list of all the things that auto capture can pull in. I believe this is primarily web, and some stuff will naturally fall over to iOS. So of course, we might have session started, session ended. Very handy events, actually. There's a bunch of other reports that get built on this to see what is the average session length, how many sessions users are having, and so forth. Page view, which many companies want. You have these 5 event properties here: the domain, the location, the path, and so forth. You can have file downloads from your app. Form interactions, you have a form started and a form submitted. Typically, the form interactions, you have to double check your app. There's a lot of apps out there that have very funky forms. They're not plain vanilla HTML forms. So these 2 events in particular may not work as expected, but if they do, it's quite handy. You have element click, so the user clicks on any page element, buttons, videos, that kind of stuff, and then it collects a bunch of stuff for you. You know, element ID, element class, position, the URL. Wow, element change, which seems to be mostly related to form elements. Network requests, which I've honestly never used myself. I actually never seen this event, but I can see that it's possible, but you have to enable it. Okay. That's fine. Web Vitals, same thing. I actually never seen this. It seems to be something similar to the Google Page Insights. That's kind of interesting. Point is, you get a bunch of these events out of the box. If we actually go into the iOS SDK, and then we go to auto capture, we can see that there's some similarities. You will have sessions, you have app lifecycles, which are typically open app background, screen views, the equivalent of page views. We have the same element interactions. We have the super hilarious rage clicks or dead clicks. I always find it funny. And then network requests. And then in each SDK, whether the iOS, JavaScript, or Android, you can then actually configure specific ones. So you could disable some of the app lifecycles if you don't care about that. You can disable screen views, element interactions, and so forth. So you do have some flexibility, whether you want all of them or just some of them or none of them, up to you. 2 things to consider when it comes to auto capture. One is how it affects MTUs. If you're trying to, say, optimize your website traffic and you only want landing pages, as we saw in the example, the auto capture may not be for you, because I do think you have to enable it on the entire JavaScript SDK, not just a portion of it. So you may want to see what that looks like. Maybe you don't load the SDK on some portions of your website. That's a possibility. Number 2 is privacy, especially some of the element interactions, form interactions. They may capture sensitive information about your app. Usually, Amplitude has built a bunch of safeguards around this to not capture credit cards, passwords. You can also have CSS classes to exclude specific elements. But again, from a privacy perspective, you just want to make sure this is not happening, especially because once you enable this, it's like a black hole. It just consumes everything. So you enable element interactions, and then overnight, you may have 1 million events coming into your Amplitude account. So really, really be careful with any privacy regulations that you may be trying to adhere to. It's also helpful to talk about the attribution portion of auto capture, which I think is super helpful. So let me see if we go down here. Now, this is only in the browser SDK, the JavaScript. We'll talk about mobile attribution in a second. But effectively, the auto capture can capture for you a lot of parameters that are really handy from a web attribution perspective. You have the standard UTM source, campaign, medium, term. But then Amplitude will actually set it as first touch. So you have like an initial UTM source, initial UTM campaign, and you will have last touch, UTM source, UTM campaign, which shows you the last values a user has seen. Now remember, Amplitude tracks us as user properties, and the user properties are always the values at that point in time, which means that if a user has multiple touch points, let's say they have 4 touch points, 4 different UTM sources before they convert, you will have those 4 values at different events during the user's timeline, which can be quite handy. It does give you the foundation to then do some kind of multi-touch attribution. You have the first one, which is the initial one, and then you may have 3 other ones as a UTM source in different events that you can then go and query. It's going to be a little trickier to do with an Amplitude, though Amplitude does have this fantastic attribution report, which is not within the scope of this video, but if you want that, we can always make a video about that. So this capture of the attribution information is really handy. It also captures the refer domain, which can be helpful for any source that doesn't have UTMs. Think like search engine traffic, like Google. It doesn't have UTMs, but you can see it with the refer. And you do capture click IDs as well. These are the click identifiers ad platforms will add to your links. Facebook click ID, Google click ID, and a bunch of other ones. So all of this is part of the auto capture. And again, you can enable just the attribution and none of the events. For mobile attribution, I have bad news. You need another provider. So you will need something like an AppSire, a Kochava, a Two, Branch, and the mobile attribution provider will do the attribution for you. And then they integrate with Amplitude and send you the data. Typically in an event that might be called install attributed. And then the event contains a bunch of event properties that are kind of equivalent to what we see here. There's going to be a source, a campaign, maybe a medium, and a bunch of other things that may be specific to mobile attribution. Second concept is diving a little bit more into the SDKs themselves. So Amplitude has added quite a few new products over the last couple of years. Let's look at the browser SDK. You may be here because of some of them. For example, you may be interested in the A/B test experimentation Amplitude has, or perhaps the guides and the surveys and a bunch of other things. So it used to be that the browser SDK, this one, the current one, was the primary JavaScript browser you needed to implement. But now, because you have a bunch of other stuff, a bunch of other products, you have multiple SDKs, let's say just on the web side. So now Amplitude has created this browser Unify SDK. You can see that the Unify SDK actually adds 4 things. It will add the analytics, which is that core browser SDK we just saw earlier. It will add the SDK for experimentation. It will add session replay, and it will add guides and surveys. So again, depending on what products you care about, the Unify SDK may actually be the best thing for you because it's a single SDK and it will load the other 4 SDKs. You still may need to do specific configuration under each SDK. If you open the session replay, this is the standalone SDK, and there is some very simple configuration that you have to go through to enable the Amplitude session replay feature. It doesn't save you from doing that, but it does save you from having multiple little scripts in your product. This is mostly for web. On mobile, you don't have that. So let me double check. I did see something on... I guess now you do have this Unify SDK for Swift, which is doing the same thing. Actually, I take that back. I was wrong. So now the same concept does apply to iOS and Android. You have the original Analytics SDK, but now you may have the A/B testing SDK and the session replay for iOS. This is actually iOS only, of course. You may need something similar for Android. So that's something to keep in mind as there's an ever-increasing number of SDKs that Amplitude has added. Now, the setup of SDKs varies from SDK to SDK, but generally there's a couple general global steps. You have to first install the SDK or initialize the SDK on mobile. On web, it just simply means you load that specific script with your API key, which we saw when we created the projects. And then you can configure the SDK to start, to initialize, again, with just the API key, or you may have specific options. There's a user ID, which we're going to see very soon. You do have some possibilities here. Remember that configuration for auto capture, for example, will be somewhere in here. If you go down to auto capture, and you see that when we initialize the SDK here on web, then we have an option to determine what auto capture data we want. This is the step where you may do any special settings, anything related to privacy, anything you want to disable or enable. This is where you do it. Okay, so let's jump into my whiteboard. This is whiteboard time. Let me zoom in here so we can read this. Let's look at some of the core tracking concepts from the SDKs. First, we have the track. Let me get a color here. Let's go red. This is how you track events. So here we can have an object here with event properties. In this case, just one property called button color and a value of primary. And then we send it to Amplitude with the event properties, right? So you can just track a basic event. I would say that most of your events will likely have some form of event property with some exceptions. We saw the verify account that had no event properties, but most do. So you're likely going to pass both the event and the event property. It's just pretty simple. So this is what your developer will be doing with all your events that you have selected for priority 1. What's the event name and what's the event property? And of course, the event properties are done dynamically. Wow, I think that's incorrect, but that's dynamically. The developers will do the logic themselves within the app to determine all the different event properties you have specified. They may have to calculate some of them or just pull them user inputs, put them together, and then send them to Amplitude. Very straightforward. Next, we get to profile properties. This is primarily if you want to send profile properties on their own. So in this case, we start this new identify event variable. We figure out the property itself, and then we send it to Amplitude. So in this case, we're going to set a property called location. Again, based on what we know now, does it make sense to send this property? Maybe not, because Amplitude will collect it for us as a Amplitude region. Let's assume this is another type of property. You can see there is no user ID here. We can set profile properties to anonymous users. Most of the time we don't. The profile properties we might care from anonymous users in particular tend to be the attribution related ones, which Auto Capture can pick up for us on web anyway. If you do want to send any profile property, this is how you can send it. Let's now look at the user ID management. How you pass a user ID is actually super simple. You do Amplitude say user ID, and then you pass the user ID itself. I actually lifted this from the Amplitude documentation, and they use an email, which again, they don't necessarily recommend. But I think this may be an outdated code. That being said, the tricky thing about user ID is to understand when to do it. So let's look at some examples here. So I created this beautiful squares, red and green. Red being the ones that are anonymous data and green being known users. So let's imagine that user arrives on your website and they view the first page, which is home right here. At this point in time, Amplitude will generate what's called a device ID. This is anonymous, it's persistent, and it's tied to that user's device, which in this case is the browser, so it will get stored at the cookie level or local storage. Device ID also generates what's called the Amplitude ID. This is beautiful writing. So these two get generated automatically by Amplitude. The user then goes on to futures, then the pricing page, and then the sign-up page. These IDs continue on. And this is how Amplitude is able to then tie events to the same user. They have the same device ID, and then the Amplitude ID is actually being generated from the device ID. It's like a logic applied to it. So now you have a profile. This is an anonymous profile in Amplitude, but you're passing events, right? These are all page view events here. Right? This can be page view, whether you do it manually or you do it with Auto Capture. They get to the sign up page, and they create an account. Now, we know sign up and login are important because this is typically when a user becomes known to us. Whether they are creating a new account or logging into an existing one, now we know who they are. So at this point in time, after a user signs up, this is when we would give Amplitude the user ID. And now, as they go to the next event and the next event, whatever those are, Amplitude actually has 3 IDs for the user. It has user ID plus it has a device ID, right, which hasn't changed, right, because the user is still on the same device. The Amplitude ID, I believe, does change because the Amplitude ID gets generated from the device ID and the user ID. So I do believe that changes. But that being said, the 2 most important IDs that we typically care about is the user ID, which because it comes from you, comes from your product backend, and the device ID, which Amplitude generates, but we can capture it and we can store it if we need to. Now, in the Amplitude profile, if you go back here, we'll see that there is, again, the Amplitude ID, then we may have the user ID, and then we actually see we have a device ID. You can see this actually device ID is different than the other ones. I expand it. There we go. This is a user that has a device ID that's been automatically generated, and a user ID was passed, and then the Amplitude ID is kind of generated from both of them. So you kind of get 3 IDs. Let's imagine now that the user goes into a mobile app. They go and download the mobile app from the App Store or the Android Play Store. Once again, let me zoom in here. At this point in time, when they first open the app, Amplitude will generate a brand new device ID and of course, a brand new Amplitude ID. And just to make it more clear, this is user ID, which is always the same. And this is A and B, and that's super clear for everybody, I know. Okay, so now we have a new device ID B. This is still an anonymous user. We don't know who they are at this point in time. They then go on to the login screen because they already have an account. And when they log in, now we tell Amplitude, actually, this is the same user. Here's a user ID. And then now Amplitude will use that same user ID from before. But now, at this point in time, we actually have, under the same profile, right? Amplitude is doing some merging behind the scenes for us. We don't see this. Device ID B. And then we have some kind of new Amplitude ID actually in this case. Again, it's being generated based on all the ones. So we still have a single profile. And in the Amplitude profile, this one doesn't have it, but there's a portion of it where you can see some of the merge IDs that are taking place. Let's see if we can see them here actually. No, it doesn't show them. You would then start to see a bunch of IDs being linked together from a bunch of different devices. And then remember, right, I usually go through this all the time. They can clear the cookies, which then restarts the device ID process. But then whenever they log in, then Amplitude says, oh yeah, this device ID actually belongs to this existing user ID. Let's link them all together. This is why the sign up and the login is so important, because this is when we keep telling Amplitude, we know this user. Here's the user ID, which hasn't changed. Whatever the device ID is, whatever Amplitude ID you have, let's all merge them so we stay consistent. Let's do one more example for bonus points. Say that user now has some kind of backend event. The first example is you're passing purchases, so you always know what the user ID is. So when you pass this event to the backend, pass on the user ID, and Amplitude will simply just link it up to the existing profile. No problem. Super simple. Imagine that you want to do 100% backend implementation. It's difficult, but it's possible. Very first time a user comes in to your product somehow, let's say this is the page view. You're passing page views through the backend. Very first time, you don't know who they are, so you cannot give this user a user ID. Instead, you have to generate a device ID and call the device ID C. But the difference here is that this is manual. You're doing this. You have to generate it, you have to persist it, you have to store it. Amplitude will generate the Amplitude ID, because remember that this is kind of generated from this. So this is auto, you don't have to worry about that. The user proceeds to fire more events, let's say more page views, and then they log in. And from that perspective now, Amplitude would then have device ID A, B, and C. And we'll save that. Save my write-in here. 3 devices ID tied to the same user ID and a single profile. If you're a curious kind and you want to know where the device ID comes from, it's a few sources. Mobile, it tends to come from the IDFV. If that's not available, then Amplitude will simply generate a random alphanumeric string for the device ID. We saw an example briefly. Web, Amplitude generates a randomly created universally unique identifier, a UUID, and then again, it stores it. You may store the device ID if you find it helpful. Sometimes you're going to do some backend events. You may want to pass the device ID. Again, it's a very specific use case. So I would first try just to pass on the user ID at login and sign up or wherever you user, and then see if there's any gaps in your data implementation before you start to get fancy. Now, there is, of course, questions here, which is, should be a user ID. Wow, that's kind of big, actually. User ID. Should be persistent, like a product backend ID is really handy. Should be privacy friendly, if you care about that, if that's something that's important to you. The easiest way we have done this is actually just by hashing the product backend ID. So we hash it using like a base64 or something like that. You could do email. Of course, our code example from above uses email. It's not ideal because email could change, first of all. Second of all, it's considered PII, which you may have an issue with. Could hash it, of course. That could be a possibility. Say if you maybe you don't want to pass it if privacy is of concern to you. So anyway, the point is it needs to be somewhat persistent. So when a user comes back, right, they log in a second time and they do this over and over again over months and years, it's always the same ID and spit it back out, because this is what Amplitude expects. You give different user IDs every time a user logs in, your data is going to be completely broken. It's going to be constantly new profiles and they won't be connected and that kind of stuff. Connection from anonymous to known is important, especially when you start to think of distribution data, right, which is going to be collected in the anonymous stage when the user first arrives to a landing page. And you need to be able to connect that later on in your product, and you do that by ensuring that the user ID is passed on. This also adds a point for backend events. We are assuming that all of this web and mobile in particular, happens in SDK. When we pass the user ID through the JavaScript SDK, Amplitude has access to the device ID and it's able to connect them. Same with the mobile client SDK. If you were to go 100% backend, that's where we need to store the device ID and then connect it to the user ID to be able to link them together. Sometimes what I've seen some companies do for backend data, because some considerations, wow, is that backend? Was it C? Okay, backend data. Is they'll actually capture the client device ID, and then they pass it with any backend events. So they're very explicitly telling Amplitude, this is the device ID we got from the user on the web. We're going to pass it back to you as a device ID, and then we're also going to pass a user ID going forward. So you can't do that. With backend data, you have to figure out all those automatically properties. For example, if you want the city, country, and region, you have to pass on the IP don't think it's dollars on IP. I think it's just IP actually. User agent, you may need to do the same for the mobile string that Amplitude uses to figure out device and manufacturer name and so on. To be able to pass a user ID whenever possible. So be able to pass that in the known events. And data is good. From a speed perspective, it's sometimes easier to start with a client as the case, especially with auto capture. You can get up and run in pretty quickly. And then over time, you add more backend events, starting with the most important events, typically things like purchases, any kind of revenue event. And you might transition more and more of your client implementation to a backend implementation. Keep in mind that even though ad blockers may and somewhere between 15 to 30% of data, even 70% to 85% of your data in Amplitude may actually be good enough for your analysis. Amplitude is not really meant as a source of truth. That is, if you want to see the total amount of revenue you made last month, you probably wouldn't go to Amplitude. You would go to Stripe or something like that. Amplitude is really helpful to understand patterns and behaviors, and 70, 80%, 90% of data is sometimes enough for that. That being said, your choice on what is the breakdown between client as the case, backend as the case, and of course, we also have other sources like a data warehouse, which may give you a higher accuracy with less challenges. A few more points on the technical notes. Amplitude does support this concept called groups. This is really helpful for B2B apps where you may have an organization and then you want to attach multiple users to the organization, and then the organization, give it some kind of group ID, give it a group name, and actually attach events to an organization here, right, as we see. And you can attach file properties to a group, and we might call them group properties. So really handy. Keep in mind though that this is an add-on. You do have to pay for this extra. But if this is what you care about, you can do it. You can of course replicate some of this by just simply using profile properties at the user level. That is, if you may have a profile property that's called something like org name, org ID, and org LTV or something, whatever. So you can attach it to the user, and then when you do reports, you can then kind of break out by the profile property. That is a possibility, and I've done that in the past. It's not as nice as the group analytics add-on, but it's a bit of a intermediate solution. What else I got here? My bag of tricks. Revenue, of course. Revenue. Amplitude does support revenue, and there is actually a special event called amplitude.revenue. This is actually from the JavaScript SDK. You will find that in many of the other SDKs. And Amplitude does have special revenue reports like average revenue per user, and I believe it has LTV and a few other ones. If you do want to see revenue in Amplitude, again, not from a source of truth perspective, but just from a trends perspective, and be able to have revenue data also means that the rest of your data can be more complete, because now you can see, let's say, marketing sources using web attribution are bringing in the highest numbers of orders based on revenue. So first, you want to use the special revenue event. You don't want to just pass a manual event called order completed. You could, but since you have revenue, you might as well use that. The second thing is, there are specific property names that Amplitude is expectant to make sense of revenue. You can see them here: a product ID, a quantity, a price, a revenue type. There is any other properties. So if you are going to use a revenue method, then you want to stick to as many of these properties as possible to make the most of your revenue data. Almost done here with this section. Can import historical data into Amplitude. There's something called the batch event upload API, which then allows you to bring in any historical data as long as a timestamp is in the past. There are specific requirements to make this work. You can see, roughly what the data structure looks like in this JSON format. I've done this before through like a BigQuery implementation. It just really depends on how valuable historical data is for you, or if you're okay just having data going forward. Amplitude also has this thing called Ampli, which allows you to force a tracking plan at the code level. I've never used this myself. You may find this helpful if you want to enforce the naming convention you establish in your tracking plan back in step 2. At the code level, again, you can also enforce it within Amplitude itself and have rules that then prevent events and event properties from being ingested if they don't follow a specific tracking plan. So you get the few technical details right, then your data is going to make a lot of sense, and you'll be one step closer to analyzing it for insights. Step 4, before you can start to make decisions with your data, we need to do one more thing. Make sure that the data is exactly what we need. That is QA. Success in Amplitude is actually what we started with. Profile of a user with their 3 building blocks as we expect them. You do testing, and your initial testing will be on dev. Remember, we created 2 projects. Then you're going to move on to production. What you're really looking for is to, again, navigate the app logically And you can clear any user data that you may have in your system by opening an browser on Chrome or Firefox. And then on mobile, you can uninstall the app and reinstall it, and that gives you a fresh slate. You go through the app logically from the very start. You create the account, you go through the onboarding, you verify your phone number, whatever you do. So wherever you picked in your tracking plan, it's P1 or P2, and you should be able to see that in your Amplitude profile come in, again, in almost real time. And are able to open the events, see that the event properties you're expecting are there. You can actually see the user properties that are being passed on. You have to make a note of which user properties were passed on previous event versus which ones were added at just this event, but you will be able to see them at every event level. You can also see where you're coming from. So in this case, this is most likely some kind of mobile session. If you do something on web, you see a web session. So you can also start to see the difference between, hey, these are all the events that I expected on web. They came in, and these are all the events I expect on iOS, or all the events I expected on Android. You can do some quick filters here. So you can actually filter events to just the ones you care about in case you have too many events. That's a possibility. Also highlight the events themselves. So something like this will then highlight the event you care about. And go in here in the plus icon and then turn on live updates. It'll show you events come in here in real time without refreshing the page. Very handy. You just see rows appear here at the top. You can find your user profile in a couple ways. So you can go to users and then user profiles. And then here you can search through your profiles through a user ID, if you know what it is. If you pass down something like email, you will have email here as a profile property. You may have a device ID, which you may be able to get in different ways. Whatever you do, you can then filter down and then click into the same profile we had before. And then you can see the data come in for your profile. There's also another report here called Live Events. Shows you all the events coming into this project, again, in real time. And we can enable this here to see those events in real time. You'll see events here, and I don't think I can actually trigger events to make this appear. You can see that the columns that may be available here, depending on what you care about. This is a second way to see data come through into Amplitude. There are some other special features that you'll have to check individually. For example, session replay. Again, this demo account doesn't have any. You may have heat maps, experiment. They kind of have their own special settings, their own specific. For example, session replay actually has an entire system status portion that then tells you if the configuration was done properly. This is a little bit out of the scope from what we want to set up. Let me know in the comments. You can dive into any of this SDKs in a little bit more detail in a future video. Since you're in production, you can also look at your MTUs against what you expected. Especially if you have very tight MTU plans and you're trying to go to your organization settings and then plans and billing, and then be able to see how many MTUs were tracked this month and what is that MTU count over time looking like for your product. Session replay also has its own usage. You can see A/B testing has its own usage. The event streaming, this is our integrations, have their own usage. So you can all see all here in a single spot. When it comes to your tracking plan, you have two options. You can maintain the Google Sheets Excel version you created. You have to be diligent though. It does take time and effort to maintain this document. As you add new events, you tweak them, you add new properties, you remove them. Not every team has the complete capacity to maintain it, and that's okay. Second option is to use the data tab in Amplitude. Give me 1 second. I have this data tab, and in data tab, you can see actually the events that are coming into your account, the event names, you can see user properties here, and a few other features again from it. So honestly, the Amplitude data sort of tracking plan can be quite handy because it's a little bit more rooted in reality. This is what's actually going through your account. Here's 30-day queries, a 30-day volume, first seen, last seen. To move your tracking plan into Amplitude is not a bad decision. Plus, it gives you a chance to do a bunch of other stuff like event descriptions, any notes. And since this is where your team will be accessing the data, it can also be a better way, a better source to track what is actually in place. If you stick all the way to this video, you should now be able to see some real data in your Amplitude account. They're in the users report, the live events, or somewhere else. And you can start building some awesome reports. If you still haven't signed up for Amplitude, remind you that there's an affiliate link in the video description that you can use to support this channel. I greatly appreciate that. Next step is, of course, to start analyzing your data. Start building reports, dashboards, look for those insights that will help you grow your product. Be sure to check out the next video and make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.